It is written, or so the faded parchment claims, in a chronicle now long lost to the shifting sands and insatiable damp of Lima's humid air. A text whispered to have been penned by a hand, guided by both awe and terror. That, when the city of kings, that gilded jewel of the vice-royalty, became burdened by the opulent sins of man, and its silver-laden ships sailed not only with the treasures of the earth, but with a heavier cargo of human pride. A fragrant bud was promised to spring from its very dust, not a blossom of earthly delight, nor a flower cultivated in the manicured gardens of the powerful, but a wild bloom, nourished by paradox, whose roots would pierce the very heart of the world, drawing sustenance from suffering, and whose petals, though unseen by many, would exhale a perfume of such holiness that it would ascend directly to the throne of the eternal King. And this bloom, fragile yet indomitable, was destined to shame the very splendor of the empire, to strip bare the gilded illusions of pomp and power, revealing the true majesty of a soul surrendered wholly to the divine. It would be a mirror held up to the face of a complacent age, reflecting not its comfortable pieties, but the terrifying and beautiful demand of radical love. A love that knew no compromise, no bounds, and no cessation. For in her, the sacred fires of ancient hermits would burn anew. Yet amidst the clamor of the colonial city, a singular testament to the enduring power of a humble heart. These lines, discovered etched into a fragment of vellum now housed in the hushed archives of a forgotten monastery, speak of a prophecy veiled in poetic obscurity, a riddle awaiting the unfolding of a life. Though the chronicle's full veracity remains the subject of scholarly debate, its evocative power, its singular blend of mystical foresight and historical lament, serves as an undeniable overture to the extraordinary life it foreshadows. For within these ancient words lies the essence of a soul's unveiled grandeur, the tale of a woman who, in the burgeoning heart of the New World, chose a path as old as the desert fathers, a path of such rigorous and uncompromising asceticism that it defied every social convention, every familial expectation, and every comfortable notion of sanctity, forging instead a unique and radical bridge between the earthly and the divine. Her name, a simple flower, would become synonymous with the profoundest expressions of spiritual devotion. Rose, the bustling city of kings, Lima, founded by Pizarro on the day of the Epiphany, pulsed with a vibrant, often turbulent life. It was a crucible of cultures, a melting pot of Spanish conquistadors, indigenous peoples, and African slaves, all living under the watchful, yet often distant, eye of the Spanish crown. Its streets, though meticulously planned on a grid, teemed with an unruly energy. The air was thick with the scent of spices from the market, the pungent odor of the Rimac River, and the sweet perfume of jasmine that bloomed in hidden courtyards. Grand churches, their facades adorned with intricate Baroque carvings, rose majestically beside the sprawling mansions of encomenderos, their wealth dripping from every gilded archway and imported silk. This was the world into which Isabel Flores de Oliva was born on April 20th, 1586. The 10th of 13 children to Gaspar Flores, a harquebusier in the Imperial Guard, and Maria de Oliva, a woman of gentle spirit and devout faith. Their home, a modest dwelling in the Santo Domingo parish, was a hub of constant activity, a symphony of infant cries, childish laughter, and the murmur of daily prayers. Gaspar, though a man of honor and duty, was often absent, his military obligations demanding long stretches away, leaving Maria to manage the ever-expanding household. She was a woman of quiet strength, her piety woven into the very fabric of her days, a constant, gentle example to her children. It was Maria who first noted the unusual tranquility and almost preternatural beauty of her infant daughter, a beauty so striking that a servant, captivated by the child's rosy complexion, declared she looked like a rose. The name stuck, supplanting her birth name, a seemingly innocent shift that would nonetheless echo the paradoxical trajectory of her life. From her earliest days, it was clear that the child called Rose was not like her siblings, nor indeed like most children of Lima. While her brothers and sisters delighted in games and childhood mischief, Rose sought solace in quiet corners, her small hands often clasped in prayer, her eyes gazing with an intensity that seemed to pierce the veil of the mundane. The family was not wealthy, and the struggle to maintain appearances in the hierarchical society of colonial Lima weighed heavily on Maria. She harbored hopes for her daughters, particularly for the strikingly beautiful Rose, of advantageous marriages that might elevate the family's social standing. She envisioned Rose as a lady of consequence, gracing the grand salons of the city, her beauty and quiet intelligence securing a prosperous future. Yet, Rose herself seemed oblivious to these worldly aspirations. While other girls her age practiced their embroidery and learned the dances of the Spanish court, Rose found herself drawn inexorably to the stories of the saints, particularly of Saint Catherine of Siena, whose radical devotion and mystical union with Christ resonated deeply within her nascent soul. She devoured tales of the Desert Fathers, their lives of extreme penance and solitude, painting a vivid tapestry in her young imagination. The cacophony of the thriving port city, the endless chatter of the market, the distant ringing of the cathedral bells calling the faithful to Mass, all seemed to fade into a distant hum when she retired to the small, sun-drenched garden behind their home. Here, amidst the fragrant jasmine and the vibrant bougainvillea, she would fashion a rudimentary grotto, transforming an ordinary patch of earth into a sacred space, a sanctuary where her spirit could commune with the divine. It was here, in these moments of profound quietude, that the first tremors of her radical path began to stir, a quiet but insistent pull away from the glittering world towards an intimacy with God that few could comprehend. Her parents, though devout, could not fathom the burgeoning intensity of their daughter's piety. Her mother, Maria, particularly struggled to reconcile Rose's burgeoning spiritual inclinations with the social realities of their lives. She cherished Rose's beauty, often dressing her in fine clothes, adorning her with flowers in her hair, and presenting her to society with a mother's proud hopes. Rose, however, perceived this earthly adornment as an obstacle, a snare for vanity, and a distraction from her true beloved. In a deeply poignant and often recounted episode, as a young girl, she was observed by her mother to have cut off her magnificent blonde hair and rubbed lye into her face to mar her own beauty. This was not an act of childish rebellion, but a profound and desperate plea, a visceral rejection of the very instrument that her family hoped would secure her worldly future. Maria was heartbroken, aghast at such self-mutilation, interpreting it as an aberration, a strange, perhaps even unsettling, expression of piety. There were arguments, tears, and attempts to impose discipline. Rose was made to undertake long, arduous hours of sewing and embroidery, her nimble fingers accustomed to the needle to contribute to the family's meager income. This demanding labor, far from deterring her, became another avenue for her devotion. She transformed the mundane into the sacred, her every stitch offered as a prayer, her physical exhaustion a humble offering. She learned to embrace the monotony, to find God in the repetitive motions, turning what was intended as a worldly imposition into a spiritual discipline. Her resolve was unwavering, her will unbending when it came to the path she sensed God was calling her to. The more her family tried to pull her towards the world, the more fiercely she clung to her spiritual convictions. A quiet rebellion of the soul against the expectations of her age and kin. The defining crucible, the fiery trial that would set Rose irrevocably on her path of radical asceticism, began subtly, a series of interior whisperings that crescendoed into an undeniable divine summons. It was not a single dramatic apparition in her early youth, but a gradual unfolding, an ever-deepening understanding of the suffering Christ that permeated her prayer life. From her early childhood, she had a profound devotion to the infant Jesus and later to the crucified Christ, finding in his wounds a mirror to the suffering she sought to embrace. The stories of the saints, particularly those who embraced extreme mortification for the love of God, became her constant companions. She devoured accounts of Saint Catherine of Siena's fasting, Saint Teresa of Avila's ecstatic visions, and the rigorous penances of the early Franciscans. These were not mere historical accounts for Rose. They were blueprints, invitations to a profound participation in the divine drama of salvation. Her heart ached to join in Christ's redemptive suffering, to offer her own small body as a sacrifice, a balm for the sins of the world that she felt so acutely in the opulent, yet often morally lax colonial society around her. She saw the glittering excesses, the cruelties inherent in the colonial system, the pervasive sins of pride and greed, and she felt a burning need to atone, to intercede. This deep spiritual yearning, however, was in constant tension with the everyday realities of her life. Her parents, especially her mother, continued to press her towards marriage. Suitors came calling, men of good standing and promising futures, representing the very pinnacle of what Maria envisioned for her daughter. Rose, already convinced of her mystical betrothal to Christ, found these worldly overtures repugnant. Each proposal, each well-meaning suggestion from her family felt like a fresh wound, a tearing away from the sacred path she believed she was called to walk. The conflict created an atmosphere of constant tension within the small household, a silent but fierce battle of wills between the expectations of family and society, and the burgeoning, unyielding call of the divine. The more intense the pressure to marry became, the more radical Rose's response grew, solidifying her conviction that only through extreme self-denial could she truly belong to Christ. This internal struggle, fought in the privacy of her heart, would soon manifest in astonishing and visible ways, marking her forever as a mystical bloom unlike any other the City of Kings had ever witnessed. The weeks leading up to the most profound of her internal revelations were steeped in an almost unbearable tension. The persistent pressure from her family to choose a suitor, to embrace the life of a respectable colonial woman, felt like a tightening noose around her spirit. Her parents, particularly her mother Maria, could not comprehend her resolute refusal to consider marriage. They saw it as an act of stubbornness, a rejection of the duties owed to her family, and a squandering of her considerable beauty. Maria's pleas, often laced with tears and exasperation, echoed through the small house. "What will become of you, child? Do you mean to bring shame upon us? Do you not see the opportunities that God has placed before you?" Each word was a fresh dart to Rose's already sensitive soul, for she loved her parents deeply. Yet her love for God, an altogether different and more consuming fire, left no room for worldly compromise. She spent hours in fervent prayer, seeking clarity, begging for strength, her heart racked by the conflict between filial duty and divine imperative. She felt a profound loneliness, a sense of being utterly misunderstood, a stranger in her own home. The only solace she found was in the hidden spaces she had cultivated for her private devotions. The small garden grotto, a secluded corner of the house, or the quiet solitude of her attic room. It was in these secret havens that she deepened her practices of penance, preparing her body and soul for an unknown, yet keenly anticipated, communion. She began to wear a hair shirt beneath her clothes, its rough bristles a constant reminder of Christ's suffering. She increased her fasting, subsisting on meager portions of bread and water, and found ingenious ways to deprive herself of sleep, her nights spent in prayer and contemplation. Her body, already delicate, began to show the strain. Yet her spirit seemed to burn brighter with each sacrifice. A profound spiritual thirst consumed her, a longing for a more complete union with her beloved, a desire that transcended all earthly comforts and familial bonds. The air in her prayer space felt charged, alive with an unseen presence, as if the very fabric of reality thinned, promising a breakthrough, a definitive manifestation of the divine will that she so desperately yearned to embrace. The revelation, when it came, was not a violent flash, but a slow, suffusing light, deepening into an overwhelming presence that transfigured her small, humble world. It occurred one evening, deep in the silent watches of the night, in the solitary sanctuary of her attic room, illuminated only by the faint glow of a small oil lamp. Rose had spent hours prostrate on the cold floor, her body aching, her mind fixed on the wounds of Christ, begging for a clear sign, a definitive direction for her life. The air grew still, the usual nocturnal sounds of the city, the distant barking of dogs, the murmur of the river, the faint tolling of a church bell, faded into an imperceptible hum. A profound silence descended, not the absence of sound, but a silence that seemed to vibrate with an unseen presence, a stillness so absolute that it felt alive, pregnant with the divine. Then, without any discernible cause, the small room was bathed in an ethereal light, not of this world, a soft, golden luminescence that emanated not from a source, but from everywhere at once, seeming to pulse with a gentle, ineffable warmth. The familiar textures of the room, the rough plaster walls, the simple wooden crucifix, the worn mat on the floor, became imbued with an extraordinary clarity, as if seen for the very first time, stripped bare of all earthly dross. And then he was there, not as a corporeal being, not as a vision to be seen with physical eyes, but as a presence that filled her entire being, overwhelming her senses, yet perfectly gentle. It was the Christ, the beloved of her soul, not in his suffering humanity, but in his glorified majesty, yet intimately near, infinitely tender. She perceived him not through sight, but through a profound, immediate knowing, a communion that bypassed the limitations of the senses, a voice, clear and resonant, yet entirely interior, spoke not in words, but in a spiritual language that infused her very soul with understanding. It was a voice of pure love, infinite compassion, and absolute authority. Rose, the divine presence communicated, I am your spouse. I wish you to be mine alone, and I desire you to be a living testament to my suffering, a mirror of my boundless love. Do not fear. Embrace the way of the cross, for in it alone lies true joy, true freedom. There was no doubt, no confusion. Every question that had tormented her, every conflict that had racked her spirit, dissolved in that instant into an absolute, crystalline certainty. The divine will was unveiled before her, not as a choice, but as an undeniable reality, an irrevocable calling etched into the deepest fabric of her being. She felt a profound sense of peace, a joy so intense it was almost unbearable, a love that utterly consumed her and left no room for anything else. In that timeless moment, her soul was bound to Christ in an eternal, mystical espousal, a covenant sealed not with rings or vows, but with the fire of divine grace. The world, with all its expectations and demands, receded, becoming a distant, irrelevant shadow. She was no longer simply Isabel Flores de Oliva. She was Rose, the bride of Christ, chosen for a path of radical, uncompromising love and suffering. The experience transcended mere emotion. It was a profound ontological shift, a transformation of her very being. When the ethereal light began to recede and the overwhelming presence gently withdrew, leaving her physically and emotionally spent, Rose lay prostrate on the floor, trembling, yet enveloped in a profound, ineffable peace. The mundane reality of her attic room slowly reasserted itself, the faint glow of the lamp once more becoming the dominant light source, the familiar sounds of the city filtering back into her awareness. Yet nothing was truly the same. The very air seemed to hum with the lingering echo of the divine encounter, and the silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the resonance of the eternal. Her body, which had been racked with the intensity of the experience, now felt strangely light, yet simultaneously anchored by an unshakable resolve. Her first thoughts were not of fear, nor doubt, nor even ecstatic wonder, but of a quiet, profound certainty. The inner turmoil that had plagued her for so long, the agonizing war between her desires and her filial duties, had ceased. The path was clear, unequivocally illuminated by the divine light. She understood, with an absolute knowing, that her life was no longer her own to direct, but irrevocably given to Christ. There was no more space for worldly compromises, no more room for hesitation or deferral. The call to embrace the way of the cross, to be a living testament to his suffering, was not merely an invitation, but a command, sealed by an act of mystical betrothal. She knew, with an intuitive certainty that transcended logic, that she must consecrate herself entirely to him, to live a life of uncompromising penance and boundless love, a life that would defy the conventional understanding of piety even within the church. The intensity of the experience had left her physically weak, yet spiritually invigorated to an astonishing degree. She rose slowly, her limbs stiff but her spirit soaring, and went to her small crucifix, pressing her forehead against the worn wood, whispering vows of absolute fidelity and eternal love. The dawn, filtering through the small window, found her not in sleep, but in a state of profound contemplation, her gaze distant yet inwardly focused on the divine spouse who had claimed her as his own. The world outside might awaken to its usual routines, but for Rose, a new day, a new life, had dawned, utterly transformed by the sacred fire of that unforgettable night. The subtle shift in Rose's demeanor, while imperceptible to the casual observer, was immediately palpable to those closest to her, particularly her mother, Maria. The quiet girl had become even quieter, her already intense gaze now holding a distant, almost luminous quality. Her devotion, once merely fervent, now burned with an unquenchable fire, manifesting in increasingly severe acts of self-mortification that baffled and alarmed her family. Maria, a woman of deep faith but practical concerns, observed her daughter's escalating penances with a mixture of fear, bewilderment, and a mother's profound sorrow. She saw Rose's increasingly gaunt frame, the faint lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes, and the quiet determination that had replaced the former internal struggle. Maria, whose hopes for Rose had been so firmly rooted in the earthly realm of a respectable marriage and social elevation, now felt those dreams crumbling. She couldn't comprehend a love so radical that it led one to reject the world's comforts, to embrace suffering with an almost joyful abandon. The domestic conflicts, which had once been sharp, tearful arguments, now took on a different quality. A weary despair on Maria's part and a gentle but unyielding resolve on Rose's. Maria tried to intervene, to moderate her daughter's austerities, to force her to eat more, to sleep more, to engage more with family life. She would hide Rose's instruments of penance or implore her to be less visible in her practices, fearing not only for her daughter's physical health, but also for the family's reputation. What would the neighbors say? What would society think of such an eccentric daughter? Rose, however, had moved beyond the realm of human opinion. Her every action, her every sacrifice, was now directed solely towards her divine spouse. She learned to weave baskets and embroider fine lace, the proceeds of which helped support her family. But she continued her radical self-denial, seeing it as the only true path to union with Christ. She wore a heavy silver crown embedded with tiny, sharp thorns, a symbolic participation in Christ's passion, hidden beneath a wreath of flowers when in public. At night, she would spend hours in prayer, often sleeping only 2 hours on a bed of broken glass and stones. Her confessors, initially cautious and even skeptical, soon recognized the authentic Spirit of God at work within her, even if they sometimes urged moderation. They witnessed the profound spiritual fruit of her austerities, not pride or self-righteousness, but a deepening humility, an overflowing charity, and an almost palpable joy that shone through her physical sufferings. She received the Dominican habit as a tertiary, a lay member who lived a consecrated life in the world, a compromise that appeased her parents somewhat while allowing her to pursue her spiritual vocation. Her small hut in the garden became her cell, a new desert within the bustling city, where she cultivated a profound mystical life, receiving visions and experiencing periods of intense spiritual ecstasy, yet never neglecting her duties to her family or the poor whom she served with a boundless compassion. She became, in effect, a living contradiction, a silent sermon in a city obsessed with material gain, her humble heart beating with a love so immense it both terrified and inspired those who encountered it. Theological reflection on Rose's life, particularly her radical path of asceticism, often grapples with its seeming extremity, its stark contrast to the modern understanding of spiritual health and balance. Yet, to dismiss her practices as mere masochism or psychological aberration is to miss the profound theological underpinnings that fueled her every sacrifice. For Rose, her self-mortification was not an end in itself, but a means, a language of love spoken directly to her crucified spouse. In an age deeply steeped in a theology of imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, Rose took this concept to its absolute, visceral limit. She saw the suffering Christ, broken and wounded for the sins of humanity, and her heart, aflame with a profound, personal love, yearned to participate in that suffering, not out of a morbid fascination with pain, but out of a desperate desire for union. She believed that by embracing physical discomfort, by making herself small and poor and wounded, she could empty herself of all attachment to the world and thus make more room for God. Her thorns, her fasts, her vigils were not acts of self-hatred, but acts of profound self-giving, a pouring out of her very being in solidarity with Him who poured Himself out completely on the cross. This was an active, rather than passive, asceticism. It was a rigorous discipline aimed at purifying the soul, stripping away all that was superfluous, all that hindered her complete surrender to the divine will. Moreover, Her penances were deeply intertwined with her missionary impulse. Living in colonial Lima, a city where the veneer of Christian piety often covered profound social injustices, where the indigenous populations suffered under the weight of Spanish rule, and where the moral climate was often lax, Rose felt an intense burden for the salvation of souls. She saw her sufferings as a form of intercession, a way to offer reparation for the sins of the world, a spiritual sacrifice to soften the divine judgment and draw souls back to God. She envisioned herself as a living bridge between the suffering of humanity and the mercy of God, a conduit for grace. Her extreme actions were not performed for public spectacle, but were often hidden, revealed only to her confessors, or discovered accidentally by her family. This hiddenness speaks to the authenticity of her motivation. Her acts were for God alone, not for human praise or recognition. Her radical path was thus a profound theological statement, a living sermon on the absolute primacy of God, the redemptive power of suffering, and the boundless capacity of the human heart, when surrendered to divine love, to transcend its own limitations and become a beacon of grace in a fallen world. The grandeur of her humble heart continued to unfold through miracles that began to punctuate her intensely ascetic life. These were not sought, but seemed to emanate from the very purity of her soul. The garden where she cultivated her roses and vegetables became a place of extraordinary occurrences. It was said that the insects, often a plague in Lima's humid climate, obeyed her command, leaving her plants untouched. Birds would fly to her, perching on her hands as she prayed, singing their praises in harmonious chorus. These were small, gentle miracles, expressions of a return to the pristine harmony of Eden, a testament to her profound connection with all of creation. But more profound were the spiritual graces that flowed through her. The sick were brought to her, not for a physical touch, but for her prayers. In many instances, the touch of a small relic of hers, or a whispered intercession, brought about inexplicable healings. A woman suffering from a severe paralysis of her arm regained full use after Rose prayed for her. Children, afflicted with fevers and wasting diseases, found sudden and complete recovery after their parents sought her aid. These were not isolated incidents, but a growing cascade of attestations, spreading her fame quietly throughout Lima, bypassing the official channels and traveling instead on the hushed whispers of the people. Her fame, however, was a heavy cross. She shunned any form of attention or veneration, deeply uncomfortable with anything that might divert glory from God. When people pressed close to her, seeking a touch or a blessing, she would often retreat, her humility almost painful in its intensity. Yet, the divine will seemed to be that her light should not be hidden. The spiritual experiences that marked her life continued with increasing frequency and depth. She would fall into prolonged ecstasies, sometimes for hours, her body becoming rigid, her face luminous with an unearthly beauty. During these states, she often engaged in profound spiritual dialogues with Christ, receiving divine insights and experiencing the ineffable joys of mystical union. There were also periods of intense spiritual desolation, what she called the dark night of the soul, where she felt utterly abandoned by God, plunged into a spiritual aridity that tested her faith to its core. These periods of dryness, however, only deepened her trust and purified her love, stripping away any lingering attachment to spiritual consolations themselves. Her life became a living sermon, a testament to both the profound realities of divine grace and the enduring power of a soul utterly surrendered. She was Peru's mystical bloom, indeed, growing in the dusty soil of Lima, exhaling a fragrance of sanctity that would reach far beyond the confines of the New World, drawing souls to the radical love that had claimed her own.